clearly we could not have come together at a better time. I mean, even just this week on the news, we've been hearing constantly about workers' rights struggles escalating into confrontations with management all over the country, from John Deere to Kellogg's to hospitals and schools everywhere. So this is really a perfect time to have an informal talk about navigating the assault on the pension system. Deliberately elaborate legalese is obscuring the efforts of financial elites to seize control of workers' collective retirement savings. And the labor guide to retirement plans you could think of as a translation for all of that. If you're having a hard time understanding what you're reading, you're obviously not alone, and neither are any of the workers you represent if you're working as a union representative. And all around, Jim wants to hear from all of you, Nari, Steve, and Alice, about the current state of worker education on retirement plans, what you think the main issues are in retirement struggles around the country. And of course, this conversation could go in many directions. In his public talks, Jim often addresses common misconceptions about the security of the pension system versus 401ks. And in this book, Labor Guide to Retirement Plans, he addresses these distorted perceptions in micro-level detail by, for example, unmasking that complex new species of a pension plan, the hybrid of a pension and the 401k, what is called the variable pension plan, which is a supposed crowd pleaser offering the best of both worlds, but in practice, which behaves more like a charlatan rolling through town, right? So you have this level of micro level detail. And then he also goes beyond that sort of micro level detail and contextualizes it with macro level perspective. So in this book, he also zooms out and talks about what he calls the applied financialization of the entire retirement system, which monthly review readers have probably thought a fair amount about. So let's start somewhere in between, leaving aside insider jargon for now, but zooming in with a case study or two. Why don't people want to discuss retirement savings, and what are the consequences of that?
Well, thanks a lot, Rebecca, and thanks a lot to everybody for taking part in this. This is really great. One of the problems those of us who are in retirement research deal with is for a lot of people, it's either a very complex topic that they just really don't want to talk about, or it's a very boring subject. Okay, I think it's a really fascinating one. I got into it in, I would say, starting around 1986, when I took a teaching job in Connecticut, and I was offered a choice between a state pension plan and a 401k-like defined contribution plan. And it was a job that was covered by a union. I got no advice from the union which way to go. The people in the HR office said, there's no question people like you go into the defined contribution plan. And it was run by TIAA, which is the biggest plan that, or the biggest administrator of academics plans. So it sort of seemed like the natural, obvious thing to do. Fast forward 5 years later, and I begin to wonder, did I make the right decision? As I studied retirement plans more and more, you can rank them in terms of what are the best and what are the least favorable. And then I discovered that mine was in the least favorable category. Okay, and then I began to look into it. And the more I looked into it, the more fascinating it became to me. I'm pretty good at simple math. So I got out a pencil and paper and looked, and I pretended I was about to retire. I pretended I was 65 at the time, and what I would get from the state pension plan versus what I would get from the defined contribution plan. And I thought that they would kind of be close, maybe the pension plan would be a little bit better. But what I found was I would get twice as much from the state pension plan, okay, as I would from the other one. And at the same time, my contributions were double those of people who were in the state pension plan. So I was paying twice as much for something that was half as much. Okay. I tried to rile my coworkers up on this, but their eyes kind of glazed over. They thought, no, this is 1990s. We're all becoming 401k millionaires. Nobody wanted to hear it. Fast forward to 2008, okay, and the bottom falls out of the market. And then people were ready to start listening. I said to people, well, the only solution to our problem is to let us take our money that we've accumulated in this defined contribution plan and put it in the state pension system in return for back credit. And a lot of people said, you can't do that. Okay, that's either it's crazy or it's probably illegal. Okay, 4 years later, after forming a rank and file inter-union movement in the state, talking all over the state, explaining the two systems backwards and forwards, we won that struggle. It was one of the few victories like that, because everybody else is being pushed in the other direction, like in Texas, that Alice is talking about. We actually were able to get into a pension plan, and that made all the difference in terms of my ability to retire and maintain the standard of living that I have. The biggest source of income for most people in retirement is a pension plan called Social Security. It is a defined benefit pension plan. It works very well. It is very popular. Every demographic loves it. Even Republicans love it, not their leaders, but most Republican voters, because 1 out of every 4 or 5 houses in the United States gets income from Social Security. It's a huge subject that's so important to people, and yet there's just not a whole lot of people who are coming from a left-wing perspective who are into this particular subject. I think on the conservative side of things, there are people all over the place and foundations and money. And the reason why it's so important to them is because there's so much money that's involved in it.
When the 2008 financial crisis rolled around, there were all these attacks on public pensions all over the country. And so we had unions in California come to the UC Berkeley Labor Center and say, you really need to work on this issue. And so we looked around and realized there are very few people nationally from sort of a left or progressive perspective working on this issue in terms of research. The other side is very well funded, right? There's a lot of sort of ideological right-wing funding going into anti-pension research. And so I wound up kind of getting sucked into fill the vacuum that was sort of the West Coast, right? Sort of academic policy research working on pension issues really from the perspective of workers having a right to have retirement security. And it's one of these areas that's really, I think, and it's one of the reasons I'm excited about Jim's book, is that the right wing has been so successful in the messaging, manufacturing an echo chamber, doing the legislative initiatives, especially at the state level, to attack public pensions, which is really the last place that workers actually have any kind of decent middle-class retirement security in the US right now because of what's happened in the private sector.
The idea for the book came from going all over Connecticut and talking, counseling hundreds of state employees. We won the right to voluntarily switch plans. And so everybody was wondering, what should I do? Okay, and, counseling them. And these were people who were heads of economics departments people who the New York Times interviewed as knowing something. They didn't know much at all about their retirement plans, okay, how they worked, what was going on. Everybody was taking it as an article of faith that if a bunch of professors are in it, it must be a good plan, because surely professors know what they're doing. Okay, well, I'm here to tell you they don't. Okay, they may be good in what they do in the classroom, but they're not necessarily good in checkbook issues. So, and then the other part of it was with union people. I mean, I'm a real union person. Okay, I have a wife who is a union organizer. I have a daughter who's a union organizer. I've been in one for many, many years. But I found that union people didn't know much about retirement plans either. So they were not able to really give advice to their members. We need something that explains retirement plans from the point of view of working people. Okay, not as a technical exercise in financial theory or business economics, okay, but one that says, okay, this plan is better than this plan is better than this plan, this is the type of reform that you need, this is what you need to watch out for.
Well, for 30 years, I was a national union staff member of the Communication Workers of America and was involved in contract negotiations for a lot of different bargaining units in both the private and the public sector. And probably the most contentious issue was healthcare, who was going to pay for it and how much. And often the next most contentious issue was pension coverage. Were workers going to continue to have traditional group pensions, defined benefit pensions as they're called, or were they going to have that kind of plan supplemented by individual retirement account coverage, 401k plans, or was their traditional pension coverage going to be replaced by inferior 401k coverage or a cash balance plan or no pension at all? So this was a big collective bargaining issue all the years that I was on active duty as an international rep, involved in negotiations, contract campaigns, and strikes. And as we've seen around the country at the moment, we have 3 or 4 major strikes just in the last month or two, where pensions have been a very hot issue, and workers have been standing up against and fighting against employer attempts to eliminate pension coverage or replace it with benefits that will be inadequate to people's retirement needs.
When we have the struggles that Steve is talking about, always management presents this as being in the best interest of the workers. Okay, and how many workers are equipped to know that that's wrong, usually? Okay, to do that, you have to kind of understand the basics of the system. And the system is not that difficult to understand, although it appears to be very difficult.
You said that you went all over Connecticut speaking, organizing rank and file meetings that weren't anti-union. They were just saying, we want you, our union, to fight for us. Right. And these workers were originally actually told that, quote unquote, shifting from a 401k to Social Security is illegal. You said that their union rep, well, members in that 401k found out, whereas they were receiving 8% of their salary, and there was a separate plan for him that came out of members' dues of 17% total. So he'd written, as you put it, a Cadillac plan for himself while trying to block what his members could get. So I wondered if this might prompt any thoughts on the part of you, Nari, Steve, or Alice. If you want to come in with your stories about things that have come up in your time fighting for pensions for yourself or for other workers.
When there is a crisis, right, then the union leadership says, okay, we need to work on this. It becomes a priority, kind of percolates to the top. When I go to the pension people, right, the staff who actually know about pensions and the unions and say, okay, can we talk long-term strategy, right? In terms of like kind of looking around the corner to the next crisis, what I hear back is like, I love what I'm hearing, but it's really hard to get the attention of the leadership So in some ways, like oftentimes retirement winds up being sometimes an issue without a really active base or constituency.
Well, I think Jim's case study in his own exemplary campaign in Connecticut is a good reminder that pensions are not only a contentious labor management issue, a point of disagreement at the bargaining table, the union on one side, the employer on the other. There's a lot of internal union disagreements about strategy related to defending and improving pension coverage. And what was great about the case study in Jim's book and several others involving other unions like the musicians is that when local union leaders were confronted by their own pension fund trustees or their own national union officials not standing up to employer demands for pension cuts, they organized at the rank and file level to put pressure on them to do the right thing. And Jim's book has, a very good case study of the Musicians for Pension Security Group in Musicians Local 802 in New York, which triggered a whole national network of pension activists, working musicians, members of the union, covered by a nationwide, industry-wide plan with 50,000 participants. The union trustees from the national union were headed in the wrong direction, and through hiring their own experts, doing their own research, educating fellow members, that pension reform movement fed into the larger effort to get some federal assistance for troubled multi-employer pension plans. We could talk also about the Teamster reform movement, the role that it played in pushing the Teamster union leadership to stand up against pension cuts at the Central States Pension Plan and others. I just think we need to remember that this can't be left in the hands, as Jim said, of the top officials and the experts and the people who often have official responsibility for bargaining. They have to feel street heat from members who are aggrieved by what employers are doing to their retirement security.
Back in 2005, George W. Bush, with advice from Chile, by the way, Jose Piñera advised him, who was the architect of the Chilean privatization, to try to start the steps toward privatization of Social Security in the United States. And people reacted against that hugely and stopped it in its tracks. Okay, they haven't had so much success among public employees. Okay, but that's the new area of battleground, is to try to do it with public employees. Now, to do this, it kind of started out by them saying these 401k type plans will bring you a lot more money. Okay, I remember in the early 1980s, that was what people commonly thought. They were going to get much, much more out of these 401ks. And there were a lot of companies, financial companies, that would put out spreadsheets showing, oh, you'll do much better in this. Well, 20, 30 years later, as people try to retire under them, it's clear that not only do they not do better, they do much worse under them. When you have a defined benefit pension plan, it has a promised benefit. Okay, and that's what keeps the system honest. Okay, they have to come up with this benefit. If you shift to a 401k, there's no promises whatsoever. Okay, so if it's totally up to the company whether to cut benefits. So, if there's some sort of a crisis like 2008 or COVID, many companies simply eliminate the 401k match. And maybe it comes back, maybe it doesn't come back. But if you do this with a spreadsheet, you'll see that elimination, then the accumulation off of it that is lost is very significant in the account. Now, one of the ways that this happens and why there's not necessarily more resistance is it's the perfect pay cut because it doesn't take away take-home pay. So workers don't see any reduction of their paycheck. Okay, it's only their future that's being messed over. But you can't do that with a pension plan. Okay, I mean, if you're going to underfund it, okay, you're going to have to come up with funds later in some way, because, you know, whether they overfund it, underfund it, whatever, the benefit is fixed in most of them. Then the argument shifts to, oh, the old style pension plans are too expensive. They just don't work. Okay, it's just not true. Okay, I mean, we have there's something like 50,000 pension plans in the United States, and most of them are in very good financial shape. We only hear about the distressed ones.
Milton Friedman, the Chicago boys, they all run down to Chile as soon as it's in military dictatorship's hands, and they undo a retirement, a defined benefit, a very stable and beloved retirement system there with the privatized one. And so it's, to me, and it's partly because I spent years in Chile solidarity work, I mean, it's such a playbook because the neoliberals create the crisis. They create it with unfunded pensions. Oh, we have a crisis. You spend all your energy trying to fund it. And then they literally in Texas came in the dead of night and suspended the rules and got, you know, they had a plan. And that's what Nari's saying. They had a plan, and we need a long-term plan that keeps people's attention on the obvious, that you want to retire with dignity. That's just obvious, just like you need healthcare, and it should be joined at the hip, and we should be organizing and teaching about it. That's all.
Alice, what you're saying just now makes me wonder, what is that playbook? What is the crisis that is manufactured? What are some of the things that you've heard? Whether it's Alice or, yeah, go ahead, Alice.
Jim can say a great deal more, but I think the you know, what goes on every 2 years at the legislature is, oh, look over there, you got this unfunded mandate in 70 years. And then while you're looking over there, they're full steam ahead trying to bifurcate and put your pension into, you know, Wall Street's hands. When you take away a stable defined benefit pension, you're destabilizing the workforce, you're increasing turnover. And that's always plan B of neoliberals is underfund the services, create a crisis, and then look for an opportunity to outsource the services.
So the manufactured crisis comes from multiple directions, right? So it's about a politics of austerity, right? A zero-sum game. And so one example is the Arnold Foundation. John Arnold, who was a sort of an Enron gas trader, billionaire, essentially took it on himself to destroy teacher pensions in the United States. So his foundation, which is now called Arnold Ventures, spent millions of dollars basically funding dozens of studies saying teacher pensions are unaffordable and they're bad for teachers. Now, in reality, if you look at women retirees, for example, the group that is doing the best are the women who are teachers, because they have their pensions, right, and they had a middle class income, and essentially the choice gets presented to the public in two ways. One is essentially, well, if you don't cut back on these expensive teacher pensions, you're not going to be able to afford to hire more teachers. This is going to compromise quality education, when it's actually the reverse. Public pensions actually keep teachers in the classroom for decades, right? It contributes to teacher quality. And so the fiscal zero-sum game, right? As opposed to saying like, why is American education so underfunded? So it really is look over here, don't look over there. And yeah, so I'll just stop there, but that's essentially happening at some level in the public pension debate all across the country. There are some states like Illinois where there was genuine mismanagement, right? Where pension funds are genuinely in trouble because all the wrong things happened. But most pension plans are, sustainable for the long run. They might need some tweaks to get there. And so this sort of crisis is, if we don't take care of these giant trillion-dollar liabilities, then you're going to have to cut police and fire, and you're not going to get services in your community.
We just got a really interesting question in the chat that I think would be interesting to address, which is from Corey Vermi. One of the more important divisions promoted by the right is between public and private sector workers and the different trajectories of private and public sector DB pension plans. Has there been any experience in the US of public pensions opening their doors to private sector workers, as is currently occurring in Canada? So that's, the second part of the question is quite interesting. First part is also quite interesting. So I'm curious what it prompts.
The answer is no. And what I'm also disappointed to see is that as we have a whole sector of workers who don't have any kind of retirement plan, right? And so one of the other areas I work in is care work. So home care workers and family-based childcare providers who are unionizing in places like California and Washington State. And so they're trying to negotiate pay and benefits with the state or with county agencies. And so when home care workers paid through Medicaid were given collective bargaining rights by the state of California, the statute specifically says that they are not public employees for the purposes of things like getting into CalPERS, right? So they were systematically cut out of the system. So I do think that, and I know that working on the private sector, sort of retirement coverage side, whenever we've approached, CalPERS has been approached many times saying, can you even run a DC program, right? Defined contribution program for private sector workers. And it's like a third rail to them because they're so protective of their tax status. There's a whole regulatory kind of framework around this that governmental plans are regulated very differently from private sector plans, that there's just a real strong political interest in keeping that line essentially impermeable, which is really too bad because that's actually where some of that's money management happens and where there's actual worker representation on boards.
Yeah, I think one of the things that the recent wave of strike activity is illustrating is the degree to which employers, as they always do, but certainly on this issue of pensions, try to divide and conquer. They try to pit younger workers or older workers against younger workers. The whole idea of a two-tier pension structure where older workers have a better retirement plan, they have traditional defined benefits, they maybe have a 401k as a supplement to that, but new hires are going to have something different and inferior. That's often sold to people, existing union members, on the basis of, hey, won't affect you, just going to affect these people that we haven't even hired yet. There's no reason why you should oppose that. And what we've seen in innumerable bargaining situations is when members, through lack of education, through poor leadership, through lack of contract campaign mobilization, go along with that, they end up not just with two-tier, but sometimes three-tier pension structures. And a lot of people, newer hires, getting the short end of the stick, and younger workers then become resentful of the higher pay and better benefit coverage of fellow union members, often doing the very same job. That's certainly an issue in the Kellogg strike right now. You got 14,000 workers out in 4 locations around the country. They've got a great strike slogan, the future is not for sale. And this really expresses their resistance to the idea that, you should have 70% of the workforce classified as legacy employees with one set of benefits, and then another 30%, the newer hires, the bottom tier, making $12 an hour less, just having a 401k with an employer match, but no defined benefit pension and no retiree health coverage. On a bigger scale, the biggest strike in the whole country is going on right now at John Deere, 10,000 auto worker members. Why are they out? They're out because they rejected a tentative agreement earlier this month. It was reached by UAW officials that would have ratified a 3-tier pension structure. New hires would get no pensions. People who've been hired since 1997 in these farm equipment manufacturing plants, would get some pension improvements, and only the highest seniority people with more than 25 years would get a decent pension boost. This is where this stuff leads. It's a slippery slope, and it's great the auto workers are standing up and fighting back now, and hopefully they'll get a better settlement in the end as a result of this militant strike activity. But this thing could have been nipped in the bud through stronger organization, better contract campaigning, better membership education, more militant and democratic union leadership many years ago.
In a lot of cases, the younger workers are simply not there at the table to defend themselves. They haven't been hired yet. And so it's just a lot easier to what Steve was talking about earlier, to settle a contract by saying that, okay, all of your pension rights are preserved and any changes will take place later on, with other people. And it's a very difficult issue, I think, because then when people come in, they begin to see that they're not going to have what others have, unless they're under the illusion that what they have is better. And that's where I think there are probably a lot of people like that. That is, if they're younger and they've got a 401k instead of a pension plan, first off, it's not a priority to think about it. When you're younger, you've got all kinds of other problems going on in your life. Okay, and this is something that's going to happen 30, 40 years later, so you may not think about it as much, so that the resistance to it may not be as much, which is all, again, an argument for everybody understanding the system as early as possible so that they can know what's going on. Because if you are, say, in your 20s and you realize that you've gotten the wrong end of the stick on this, there may be time to organize something, okay, to try to rectify this. Okay, but if you don't think about it, okay, or you just assume that it'll work out in the end, by the time you realize that it won't work out in the end, it's too late.
Well, I think it's unions trying to be more proactive, knowing that this is a common employer strategy to try to pit younger and older workers against each other, to structure their management proposals in a way that furthers that. And you can't deal with challenges like that unless you have a comprehensive contract campaign plan. You start preparing for bargaining with a lot of membership participation, 12 or 18 months before contract expiration. If you have the ability to wage an effective strike, you have to make extensive preparations for that. You have to do a lot of membership education. You have to line up community allies. It's very important in a lot of these pension reform struggles and strike campaigns over pension issues that you have allies in the community, and that if you're a public employee and you're taking a strong stand, you have a message to private sector workers who are, as taxpayers, paying for your pension benefits, but who may not in their own jobs have any benefits at all or may have inferior coverage. And as we've discussed earlier, may be ripe for right-wing propaganda, which pits the private sector workforce against remaining public sector union members who still have better traditional defined benefit coverage. So there's a lot of things that unions have to take into consideration when they're facing a showdown over these or any other issues. But waging a fight at the last minute without a strong message, without labor community coalition building and laying the groundwork by building up your steward system and expanding rank and file participation in the bargaining process, having open bargaining. These are all essential tools for any successful contract fight, particularly one about pensions.
I would say a common question that I get is, okay, I'm about to retire. I have several $100,000 in my 401k account. What should I do? Okay, and the basic answer that I have is that there are no good choices. And that's one of the problems. Okay, now you can keep investing it and hope that the stock market will be kind to you. But then, how much should you withdraw every year? Do you know when you're going to die? Are you your own actuary? Nobody knows that. So and then as you get older, you may be less capable of managing your own investment system. So the private sector has an answer to that, which is that you can turn your money over to them and they'll sell you an annuity. A life insurance company will do that. Okay, but the problem with the annuity is it's very expensive. They subtract commissions, they subtract fees, they're out there advertising. Okay, every time you see one of these 4-color ads in the New Yorker or elsewhere, who's paying for it? You're paying for it out of your money that's invested in these companies that run it. So they've kind of got you coming and going. Okay, that is, they're taking money during the accumulation phase, and then during the deaccumulation phase, they take more money. My solution, okay, which doesn't exist yet, okay, would be for Social Security to allow you to roll your 401k accumulation into it in return for a larger benefit check every month. That would be a much better deal because it would be essentially a nonprofit annuity. Okay, and then it would take advantage of the risk sharing, which is, I think, the primary advantage of pension funds.
Speaking of the audience, I see some interesting questions in the chat from members of the audience. I even recognize some of the people with these great questions. So I'm wondering if we could switch to that for a little bit and throw some of these in Jim's lap. There's 2 questions I see from folks in the clerical unit represented by the Teamsters in the UC system. One person questioning an apparent agreement that has encouraged what looks like lump sum cash outs. And someone else calling attention to the fact that the pension plan management for that bargaining unit has apparently been contracted out, used to be done in-house, I guess, in the state. Maybe Jim could kind of comment on those 2 issues in general. And then I also see a very good question from a retired Oakland teacher wanting to know what we think about activist investing strategies, pension plans divesting from fossil fuel stocks and being socially responsible investors on behalf of their plan participants in other ways. I think the clerical worker questions, since they're close to home out here in California, would be of interest. Jim, do you have any thoughts about?
Well, I'm not a great fan of cash outs. I think that one of the real important benefits of a pension is that it gives you income for life. And if you can't take a cash out, then you're the one who's responsible for managing that for the rest of your life, so you don't run out of money. And it's a kind of a gamble in that way. I mean, it might work, might not work, Much better to have something that's a secure payment that you can adapt to over time. As far as the whole question of leveraging pension funds for social purposes, there is a book called Labor's Capital, which discusses all of that. A lot of it gets into very knotty issues, though, of fiduciary responsibility of pension funds, whether they can invest in things that may make sense from the point of view of labor, but don't necessarily deliver the highest return to workers. And so that's I think, a kind of gray area as far as what can be done with it.
Can I address those questions a little bit? And I'm obviously in UC, but in terms of cash outs, I actually just got a very similar question from actually a Kaiser health worker who's part of IFPTE in California, and it's really interesting. There's basically all kinds of terrible sort of retail street level financial wisdom out there that's actually not wisdom at all. So workers really think that they can take a pension. So for instance, a UC pension, if you take a cash out, you're essentially taking a 7% a year, right? Guarantee. That's how it's priced according to their expected rate of return. So you cannot get a 7% return guarantee anywhere in the market, nowhere, right? So, and certainly super low fees and all of that. So you just, basically what I tell people is, unless you have cancer, like that you have very short life expectancy, do not take the lump sum cash out, because it's a very bad deal. And there's a whole industry of people out there essentially trying to peddle products. They're really essentially saying, take a lump sum and you can invest it in my annuity, right? That looks really good on the surface, but you dig in and there are really high fees and it's just a terrible deal. And just to let you know, there is some awareness of this at the federal level, that retirees are not getting good advice on the cash out decision. And with regard to kind of the labor's capital issue, and it's important to know that, especially in terms of the attack on public pension funds, because, right, these funds have worker representation, often worker representation on the boards of trustees. And because, CalPERS is one of the largest institutional investors in the world alongside CalSTRS. And so they're going in with shareholder resolutions on corporate pay, CEO pay and things like that, and sort of environmental policies. So it's really clearly the sort of the subtext is obviously destroy unions, and also that workers' voices have no room in the corporate boardroom, right, in corporate governance and any of these decisions. And you contrast that to like George Bush's notion. Do you remember the ownership society, right? Because I've got some mutual fund that I am now an owner of capital, when I actually have no say, that in these large pension funds, that workers actually do have a say in how that capital is managed. And that's one of the reasons that these public pensions are under attack. So I'll talk about sort of underfunding in private pension funds. And there's sort of two, there's a single employer plans, which are the corporate DB plans, and then the multi-employer plans, which tend to be sort of Taft-Hartley union trusts. So there is the Pension Protection Act of 2006, which sort of actually was supposed to bolster private sector pension funding, but had the effect of basically accelerating corporations dumping plans, because what it did was say that you have to use the risk-free kind of low interest discount rate to fund your pension every year. And that basically, one of the things that it did was and sort of market valuation of assets with virtually no smoothing, which public pensions do smoothing over 3 or 7 years. What that meant was that annual funding requirements just were all over the place, right? It was really unpredictable. So it made plans even less attractive to keep sponsoring for private employers. And then we have the multi-employer plans. And I see people in the audience here who know a lot more about this than me, but But one of the challenges is that these are supposed to be, you know, large pools of workers in entire industries. And so the rationale is, well, we are sort of self-insuring. We don't have to pay as high a premium to the Pension Benefit Guarantee Corporation, which is essentially the kind of the federal insurance company that backstops all private pensions. And so we know what happened to a lot of these industries. The demographics just got turned upside down. They entered a sort of death spiral in terms of funding. And so, and that is a story that is in Jim's book, right? In terms of some of essentially kind of the saga of kind of the struggles over, you know, should these or can these benefits be cut? And then, you know, the real win was that basically in the last stimulus package, right, there was a federal bailout. And I will tell you, I was at a House committee hearing where the Republicans were, I mean, it's just angry, really, really angry about that. And the cost of that bailout was basically a fraction of what the US spends every year subsidizing the retirement accounts of the top 20% of earners in this country. So to me, it seemed like a good deal. So this is, you know, so it sort of raises this issue of that we do need sort of good systems in place to make sure private and public pensions are well funded. And at the same time that this is, you know, I think there is a really good, the Republicans are really terrified of the federal government bailing out public pensions. And I think, and also private pensions. And I think there's a really strong kind of organizing moment here. And I think the labor movement was extremely successful, right? This is a really huge win in preserving the benefits of, I forget what the number of retirees was, but basically they were looking at huge haircuts for their benefits, and they managed to avoid that. So I'll stop there.
The problem is like with the Uber drivers, you know, who's going to pay the employer side of it? You know, and I think it's really quite unfair for gig workers to have to pay both sides of that. And what should happen is that in some way the rest of Social Security subsidizes that, so that people would pay the same amount that everybody else does, 6.2% of income. Now, have to realize also that that's one of the major arguments for 401ks, is that they're very flexible and very portable, okay, which is true. They are portable. I mean, you can go from an employer to employer to employer, and you know, the answer they would say is, well, the gig worker ought to open up an IRA, individual retirement account, and then start saving their money. Okay, the problem there is it just doesn't work. I mean, you can save money, but you're not going to be able to save enough to have a reasonable retirement income.
One of the points I always make when I talk about this issue is that we have a US, basically American retirement system outside of Social Security assumes either that you basically are employed by a firm, right? Employee-firm, employer-employee relationship, or that you're sort of a self-employed entrepreneur, right? And then you'll go out and open up an IRA. And so one of the points I always make is that there's just huge segments who they just don't fit in that mold, right? So I'll go back to home care workers. We've got 1 million home care workers in this country who work for a client, right? So they're employed by a family or a disabled person who's not going to have the wherewithal to set up, you know, any kind of retirement plan, right, for their caregiver. So they just have nowhere to turn in terms of even thinking about trying to get a retirement benefit. So I do think that this is one of the reasons I keep going back to Social Security, is that it's sort of the easiest place to capture a share of people's earnings and to accumulate benefits, because the current system as designed, what to tell you, like I've consulted with domestic workers unions and other care workers, domestic and care workers unions sort of dealing with this because they don't fit into these boxes that the federal government has set up. There's just really nowhere for them to turn. And so I think having, even if it's a parallel program to Social Security, it's like we already have a system for collecting payroll taxes, right? And the other thing too is that other countries have, notions of a dependent contractor, right? So the notion is that, if you're a company and you're paying somebody as an independent contractor, and you're basically their sole source of income, that you have to make retirement contributions for them, right? And I do think that this is a struggle that the labor movement is having with regulators. It's an internal struggle within the labor movement ideologically about what to do about modernizing labor laws to reflect what's happening today. Whether we sort of try to stick it out and try to cram workers into the boxes that we have, or to try to come up with sort of new laws. But as it is right now, a lot of workers just kind of stuck outside the system. There's a really great question right off the bat, which is in view of the demise of private DB pensions, plans for most of today's workers, should Social Security retirement benefits be enhanced to help fill the DB pension gap? And I would say, I had a Facebook post recently just because I was so inspired. I actually had a conversation via email with a chief actuary at Social Security because I was modeling benefits for a study, and kind of got really deep in the weeds and realized that the system is so much more progressive than most people understand. So we understand sort of intuitively that replacement rates are higher, right? That low wage workers get sort of a bigger benefit in relation to their lifetime earnings than middle wage and high wage workers do. But there are other sort of technical aspects that I'm not going to kind of dive into, but what it does is basically it makes sure that benefits actually keep pace with the generational standards of living, which no other system really does. And then there's a full COLA, right? So we had a high inflation year, and now retirees are getting, over 5% COLA increase. My mother is actually really looking forward to that, and I'm sure a lot of other beneficiaries are too. So this, I think, is really kind of is a real jewel that we need to protect and find ways to expand. And the other thing is that there's a whole group of workers who were never included in the DB pension world, are not getting even 401k. They're just completely left out of the system, right? So they're the workers who are left out of things like the Fair Labor Standards Act, right? Sort of domestic workers. It sort of percolates down today to home care workers, and it's sort of non-standard workers, gig workers. There are a bunch of workers who just don't fit into the system in any way, and all they have is Social Security. So when we talk about sort of actually having universal retirement security in the United States for all workers, that Social Security is really the first thing that we need to be talking about. Get off my soapbox.
Yeah, the hackneyed phrase is the three-legged stool. Like that's what you're supposed to have: Social Security, a defined benefit pension, and then private savings. And then what's happened is they collapse the second and the third into one. So it's just Social Security and savings account, which is what the 401k is. Okay. I did some looking at countries, with different systems. Okay. And most of the countries that have the most generous retirement systems just have a single system. Okay. They don't have a three-legged stool or anything like that. They have, it's one giant Social Security system, and that's what people live on. And that's the direction that I think we need to move on. I mean, it's a lot like Medicare for all, Social Security for all. I mean, anybody who really studies Social Security, and the people who put it together in the 1930s with forerunners in the 20s and the 10s and the aughts, building on the German system, okay, realizes just how far thinking they were with it, okay, and that it works very well as long as you keep, the types of reforms along the way that need to be done to keep everything in balance. Okay, which is now they're playing this game of chicken in Washington in terms of, trying to see if Congress does absolutely nothing with Social Security, then it'll force a crisis, in 2032, something like that. Okay, but it's very easy to keep adjusting it along the way. And if you ask me what I would like to do, I would like to do away with employer plans and have just everybody in Social Security, maybe at different levels where people could put their savings accounts in it. Yeah, I'll throw in a comment about the last question about the cap on Social Security income that's taxed, which I think it's 148,000 now, which probably for most people watching this is all of their income. It falls under $148,000. Okay, but for rich people, that's a very small amount if you're talking about the 1%. So, the question is why should there be any cap at all? Okay, why shouldn't it just be wide open? It is for Medicare, okay, for labor income. But here's again the subtlety that you may not be thinking about is that for rich people, especially when you get to over $400,000 income, most of their income doesn't come from labor income, it comes from investment income. And Social Security could get a lot more revenue out of beginning to tax investment income than it can from raising the cap. I mean, I think that the cap should be raised, but in addition to it, there should be the taxing of capital, okay, capital income. Yeah, I think it's a question of kind of where you're at in this. I mean, most people, let's say half of people have nothing, okay, in terms of retirement plan. Let's start with that. Okay, and so they should either be fighting for some sort of employer plan where they are, or an expansion of Social Security, one or the other. Then the biggest percentage of people who have a plan have something like a 401k, okay, of which they vary tremendously between ones where the employer makes no contribution to it whatsoever, to ones that they contribute as much as 15 or 20%. Okay, by the way, okay, I did the calculations, and if you want to know how much you have to put into a 401k, okay, I calculate it's between 25 and 30%. Okay. I can see the stunned looks, okay, that are out there because nobody can do that, right? So I think it's an impossible system. Okay, if you were going to try to match what you could get in a defined benefit plan, you would have to put in 25 to 30%. So, that's the situation for them, or look for a different job, that has a decent plan. Okay. Now, another possibility is if you're in a 401k, is to start thinking along the lines of the annuity reform. Okay. Is there a way to reform annuities so that I can stay in my 401k, but then get a decent, annuity out of it? And that's where I think Social Security could solve that problem for a lot of people. If you're in a defined benefit plan, fight like the dickens for it, and also fight to improve it, because every plan can be improved. Right now, everybody's defensive about these things. Okay, but there are a lot of improvements that don't necessarily cost the employer of the plan anything. Okay, for example, if you've spent 15 years in a 401k and then you get a job in a defined benefit that comes with a pension plan, you should be able to purchase service credits, meaning that you should be able to roll that 401k into it to get 5 years, 10 years, 15 years credit, which would be good for you. But not all plans have that feature. Okay, but it doesn't cost them anything to put that feature in, okay, because you can make it actuarially neutral. So there are a lot of reforms that if you understand the system, you should not have a whole lot of opposition from employers.
So here we are at the end of our time together. And of course, as you might have expected, you get all of the advice in the last 5 minutes that you needed. So I'm going to prompt everybody to watch the whole thing so they can get to Jim's, choice advice at the end.
I want to thank everybody else for their great contributions and put in another plug for Jim's terrific book. We need it in every labor education program in the country. We need it in every local union library. We need a lot more labor publications reviewing it, and a lot more people going into bargaining about pensions and other issues, reading it before they get to the table and have to deal with employers who are often better prepared than they are. So